As of this weekend, Brent crude oil is sitting at $103 a barrel. 16 days ago, on the last day before the war began, it was $72.48. That is not a market fluctuation. That is not a cycle correction. A 43% move in 16 days is a price signal that something fundamental has broken. And what has broken is the mechanism that kept global energy flowing. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively closed since the 28th of February. Ship traffic, which once moved 20 million barrels of crude and petroleum products through that waterway every single day, has fallen to what the International Energy Agency, in its March report released this week, calls a trickle. The IEA does not use casual language. This is the body that coordinates energy security for 32 countries across 3 continents. Its March oil market report opens with a sentence that belongs in history books. The war in the Middle East is creating the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, not the largest this decade. The largest in history, bigger than the Arab oil embargo of 1973, bigger than the Gulf War of 1990, bigger than anything the modern energy system has ever been asked to absorb. Most people are still processing this as a war story, tracking military movements, watching geopolitical chess. But the story that will reach into most people's lives, into grocery bills, heating costs, and mortgage rates, is not the military story. It is the economic story assembling itself behind the headlines. Here is the core argument. This is no longer just an oil shock. The oil price spike is the most visible signal. But behind that number, a second wave is building. One that has nothing to do with oil directly, but everything to do with what oil touches when it is priced this high for this long. Fertilizer, plastic, food, the inputs people buy every week without thinking about where they come from. Many of those inputs move through the Strait of Hormuz. 3 years. That is how long the world, major central banks, spent hiking interest rates, crushing demand, and grinding inflation back towards something manageable. The post-pandemic inflation wave was brutal. The response was painful. And it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but it worked. By early 2026, inflation was approaching target in most advanced economies. Economists were cautiously using the phrase soft landing. And then the Strait of Hormuz closed. The emergency response that 32 nations have already launched is the biggest coordinated release of strategic oil reserves in 50 years of international energy policy. Based on the arithmetic, it buys roughly 40 days of buffer. Not 40 months, 40 days. And the crisis shows no sign of ending. This is the full economic story. Let us get into it. Most people have heard the name Strait of Hormuz for years, usually attached to geopolitical threat language. What rarely gets explained is why the strait is irreplaceable, because irreplaceable is exactly the right word. There is no detour at scale. There is no pipeline network that closes the gap. This is not a failure of planning. It is geography. The strait sits between Iran to the north and Oman and the United Arab Emirates to the south. At its narrowest point, it is 21 miles wide. Within those 21 miles, the navigable shipping lanes, 2 miles in each direction, are what the entire Persian Gulf uses to reach the open ocean. 2 miles, the width of a modest city, downtown, is the channel through which 1/5 of the world's daily oil supply flows. Before the war, roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products moved through the strait every single day. The United States produces about 13 million barrels per day domestically. The global oil market consumes around 102 million barrels per day. The strait by itself was moving 1/5 of total global daily consumption through a 2-mile lane, surrounded on 3 sides by Iranian territory. Gulf producers have pipeline alternatives, but they are limited. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, running from the Gulf Coast across to its Red Sea terminals, has a capacity of 7 million barrels per day. The UAE has its own bypass line. Together, these alternatives can move perhaps 8 to 9 million barrels per day outside the strait. But before the crisis, Gulf producers were exporting roughly 20 million barrels per day. The math does not balance. The gap is not bridgeable by the alternatives that exist. And the strait does not carry only crude oil. About 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas exports move through it. Qatar's gas, Abu Dhabi's gas, heading to buyers in Japan, South Korea, China, and Europe. Diesel and jet fuel travel the same route. So does the feedstock for fertilizers, the raw inputs for plastics, the chemicals underpinning pharmaceutical and battery manufacturing. When the strait closes, it does not sever one supply chain. It severs a dozen simultaneously. The world found out exactly what that means on the 28th of February. The IEA's March oil market report, published on March 12th, contains figures that require a moment to absorb. Gulf producers. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar have been forced to cut their combined oil production by at least 10 million barrels per day. Not from strategic choice, not from political calculation, from necessity. Storage tanks across the Gulf are filling up. When you cannot export, you eventually cannot produce. The oil has nowhere to go. The IEA projects that global oil supply will drop by 8 million barrels per day in March alone. Kazakhstan and Russia, sitting outside the choke point, are stepping up output and partially offsetting the loss. Partially. The net gap remains enormous. For historical context, the Arab oil embargo of 1973, the event that created gasoline lines around city blocks in America, forced price controls in Europe, and triggered a global recession, removed approximately 5 million barrels per day from world supply, is less than hash zero. One hash is greater than 5 million. That was the benchmark for 50 years of what a serious oil supply shock looked like. The current disruption is running at double that magnitude, and it arrived in days rather than months. Goldman Sachs quantified the collapse at the Strait precisely. Persian Gulf exports tracked by vessel count data have fallen to roughly 3% of their pre-war level. 3%. That is not a disruption. A disruption is when traffic is reduced and rerouted. 3% is what remains after everything else has effectively stopped. The strait is technically open. But insurance withdrawal, attack threats, and crew safety refusals have achieved what a physical blockade would have done. The outcome for cargo flows is essentially the same. The secondary collapse is in refining capacity. More than 3 million barrels per day of Gulf refining capacity has already shut down. Not from direct bomb damage in most cases, but because export routes are blocked and product storage tanks are full. A refinery that cannot export cannot run. A further 4 million barrels per day of refining capacity is now at risk. The IEA specifically identifies diesel and jet fuel as the most exposed product markets globally, the ones where substitution options are most limited. Iraq's production has fallen from roughly 4.3 million barrels per day to between 1.7 and 1.8 million. A 60% output drop in one of the world's 5 largest producers in under 3 weeks. The oil exists. The problem is that the only viable route to market is blocked. Governments then tried to do something about that. On March 11th, the International Energy Agency announced something extraordinary. 32 member countries unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from their strategic reserves, the largest coordinated emergency oil release in the 50-year history of the agency. Markets initially reacted. Then Brent broke $100 again in Asian trading on March 12th, the morning after the announcement. The market read the action accurately. 400 million barrels sounds enormous until you run the arithmetic. At the current rate of combined supply loss, roughly 15 million barrels per day of crude and refined products, according to Bob McNally, president of Rapidan Energy Group. 400 million barrels covers about 26 days of the gap. But reserves cannot be released at any rate the crisis demands. The infrastructure for drawing down strategic stockpiles has physical constraints. The United States, contributing 172 million barrels, nearly half the total, will release those barrels over 120 days. That works out to approximately 1.4 million barrels per day. 1.4 million against a gap of 15 million. That is roughly 15% coverage of the daily supply loss. Not enough to stabilize prices. Not nearly enough to replace what the strait was carrying. The IEA release also does nothing for liquefied natural gas. Strategic reserves hold oil, not gas. 20% of the world SLNG was flowing through the strait. Qatar halted production and declared force majeure on its gas contracts in early March. The reserve release cannot touch that dimension of the crisis. Japan moved before the formal IEA agreement was even finalized. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi announced on March 11th that Japan would release 80 million barrels from its national and private sector reserves, beginning on March 16th. Japan holds 254 days of total consumption in strategic reserve, which sounds comfortable until you realize that roughly 90% of Japan oil shipments normally pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And Japan's trade ministry projected oil shipments from the Middle East would drop sharply from March 20th. Tokyo could not afford to wait. The domestic fuel price spike that was coming could not be absorbed without immediate intervention. Analysts at Bernstein told clients the IEA action would have limited impact on oil price trajectory. Vivek Dar, Director of Mining and Energy Commodities Research at Commonwealth Bank of Australia, put it plainly. The market is underestimating the disruption, and Brent could surge toward $120 to $150 per barrel if physical shortfalls materialize. 400 million barrels was the biggest emergency response in history. The market absorbed the announcement and kept pricing oil higher. Here's the part of this crisis that energy headlines consistently undersell because it requires understanding supply chains most people do not spend much time thinking about. Oil is not the only thing that travels through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait is what energy analysts call a multi-commodity choke point. It carries crude oil, yes, but it also carries the gas that makes fertilizer, the feedstocks that become plastic packaging, and the industrial chemicals that go into pharmaceuticals, batteries, and semiconductor manufacturing. When it closes, it does not spike the price of one thing. It spikes the price of the inputs to nearly everything. Start with fertilizer, because the timing here is almost perfectly destructive. The Gulf is one of the world's largest producers of nitrogen fertilizers, the chemical compounds that most global crop production depends on. Roughly one-third of the world's seaborne fertilizer trade moves through the strait. Since the war began, the price of urea, the nitrogen-rich compound at the core of most fertilizers, has jumped 35%. At the major fertilizer trading hub in New Orleans, urea prices have moved from $475 per metric ton to $680. And the timing could not be worse. Northern Hemisphere farmers buy fertilizer in March to apply in April and May. The planting season does not wait for geopolitical resolution. Carnegie Endowment researchers noted something specific that tends to get lost in the energy coverage. Even if the strait reopens tomorrow, restarting fertilizer production and getting it to export markets takes weeks that Northern Hemisphere farmers simply do not have. The president of the South Carolina Farm Bureau has already said farmers may not be able to finance their crop planting this season. Corn, wheat, and soybeans, the three most fertilizer-intensive staples in global agriculture, are the ones directly in the path of this disruption. Now add plastics, about 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East, the raw material for most consumer packaging, move through the Strait of Hormuz. Polyethylene is in everything on every supermarket shelf, the packaging on every food product, the containers in hospitals, the films wrapping every shipped item. Supply chain analysts at Moody's have flagged that shortages and backlogs will raise the price of packaging, automotive components, and consumer goods once factory inventory buffers run out. The typical buffer period is 4 to 6 weeks. That window is now closing. The disruption extends further still. The Gulf supplies significant volumes of helium, critical for semiconductor manufacturing, and sulfur, which underpins fertilizer chemistry and copper processing. Petrochemicals move through the strait to Asian garment manufacturers, the pharmaceutical supply chain, and battery production. When supply chain professor Usha Haley of Wichita State University said all of these factors will cascade through global supply chains and raise consumer prices within approximately a month, she was not speculating. She was describing a mechanism. The oil price spike is the one everyone is watching. The inflation it is building across every adjacent supply chain is the one most people are not yet tracking. But the pipeline is already flowing. Let us trace how this becomes something people actually feel in their wallets. The most obvious channel is gasoline. In the United States, pump prices have already risen roughly 20% since the war began, with the average gallon moving from $2.98 to $3.56, according to AAA. Goldman Sachs, in its baseline scenario, forecast gasoline reaching $3.50 nationally, and warned the upside case is considerably higher. For a household running one average vehicle, the annualized cost increase runs several $100s, on top of everything already squeezing household budgets. In Europe, the shock ran through natural gas. After Qatar halted production and declared force majeure in early March, European gas benchmarks exploded. Prices sitting around 30 euros per megawatt hour shot to 46 euros on March 2nd, and briefly peaked above 60 euros on March 3rd, nearly doubling in a week. Utility costs, industrial electricity prices, and heating bills follow. European manufacturers running energy-intensive processes face a sudden input cost surge with no hedge against a closure nobody anticipated. In Asia, the exposure runs deepest in the countries that import most of their energy from the Gulf. Japan relies on the Middle East for roughly 95% of its oil, with about 90% of those shipments passing through the strait. India faces a dual shock. More than half of its LNG imports are Gulf-linked, and a significant share are Brent-indexed, meaning the crude price spike hits both the physical supply and the contract pricing simultaneously. South Korea's net oil import bill represents 2.7% of its gross domestic product, among the highest ratios in the world. Korea and Japan each hold between 2 and 4 weeks of LNG in reserve. That buffer is not long. The food transmission channel is slower but potentially more durable. Wolf Research chief economist Stephanie Roth estimated the fertilizer disruption alone could add roughly 2 percentage points to food-at-home inflation in the United States, adding approximately 0.15 of a percentage point to the overall headline figure on top of the roughly 0.40 coming from energy. American food prices have already risen nearly 24% above pre-pandemic levels. This is not a population with significant tolerance for another round of grocery inflation. The IMF standard model estimates a sustained 10% rise in energy prices adds 40 basis points to global inflation and shaves 0.1 to 0.2 percentage points from global GDP growth. Brent has moved 43% in 16 days. The transmission math scales accordingly. This is where the story becomes directly painful for anyone expecting this year to bring financial relief. For 2 years, the Federal Reserve had been slowly lowering interest rates. 3 cuts in the final months of 2025. Before the war, Goldman Sachs had projected at least 1 more cut in the first half of 2026. The ECB had been holding steady, with a pathway toward easing looking plausible by mid-year. Rate cuts mean cheaper mortgages, cheaper car loans, lower credit card rates. The normal human reason to care about what central banks do. That framework is now suspended. Goldman's economics team raised its December 2026 headline PCE inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points to 2.9%, and cut its GDP growth forecast by 0.3 percentage points to 2.2. The June rate cut is off the table. Goldman now sees the first cut pushed to September at the earliest. In their upside scenario, where disruptions last a full month and Brent averages $110 through spring, headline PCE peaks at 4.5%. The Federal Reserve's target is 2. The distance between 2 and 4.5 is exactly the kind of distance that makes rate cuts institutionally impossible. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said this week that the Iran situation puts the Federal Reserve even more on hold, more reluctant to cut rates than it was before the war. The Fed holds its benchmark rate in a range of 3.5 to 3.75%. Cutting while inflation is accelerating upward would be a serious credibility error. But not cutting while the labor market is showing strain. February shed 92,000 jobs and unemployment rose to 4.4%. Creates its own kind of pressure. The European Central Bank faces the structural equivalent. ING economists stated that a rate cut is definitively off the table for the ECB's March meeting. The Bank of England, historically among the most sensitive central banks to supply-driven headline inflation, sits in the same bind. What all 3 institutions face is the classic energy shock dilemma. Inflation rises, which makes rate cuts impossible, which leaves economies without the stimulus they were counting on, which slows growth, which makes the inflation more painful because wages cannot absorb it. Stagflation, low growth and high inflation simultaneously, is not the base case for most analysts, but Ed Yardeni, one of Wall Street's most followed strategists, now assigns it a 35% probability. Kalshi prediction markets are pricing the U.S. recession probability at 32.5%. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario where Brent averages $140 for 8 weeks, mild contractions in the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan, and meaningful GDP damage in the United States. 140 is not an impossible number from where we sit today. Here is the detail that ties all of this together. From 2022 through 2024, the world conducted the most aggressive coordinated inflation-fighting campaign since the 1980s. Central banks hiked rates simultaneously across 20 major economies. Demand was compressed. Households absorbed years of elevated prices, and it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but it worked. By early 2026, headline inflation was approaching 2% in most advanced economies. The Federal Reserve had begun cutting. Economists were writing about the soft landing as something that had actually been achieved. And then a strip of water 21 miles wide closed. Everything that 3 years of tightening accomplished in the energy price dimension, the grinding down of inflation that began with Russia, its invasion of Ukraine in 2022, is now at risk of being rebuilt. Not by policy error, not by fiscal recklessness, by geography, by the one choke point that every analyst, every military planner, every intelligence community for 50 years identified as the single most dangerous pinch point in global energy supply. The emergency machinery is running. 32 countries have committed the largest strategic reserve release in history. Japan is drawing down its national stockpile starting tomorrow. None of it is remotely sufficient. All of it is slow. None of it addresses the fertilizer markets, the plastic supply chains, the LNG flows, the food inflation building in the background. Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Group said this week that the crisis is likely to last months rather than weeks, and that markets are underestimating the disruption. The Brent futures curve agrees with him. Oil for delivery in July is trading above $90. Not as a spike that traders expect to fade, but as a structurally elevated price, reflecting expectations of ongoing supply problems through the summer. The price of everything that depends on energy, which is to say the price of nearly everything, is about to move. Some of it is already moving. Gasoline at the pump, food at the grocery store, heating bills, the goods wrapped in plastic packaging on every shelf. These are not abstract variables in an economic model. They are the bill that arrives in real households, in real dollars, in the next 30 to 60 days. The world just spent 3 years paying down an inflation debt. What is happening in the Persian Gulf right now is the beginning of a new one.